Let's look at how we can create a parallax effect in Photoshop. The parallax effect is an interesting effect that takes a static photo and brings it to life with subtle movement. This is often called 2.5D, or the parallax effect. The effect makes use of Photoshop, and you basically cut out an image, and then you'll use the timeline feature to convert a still picture into a video. I will show you how to do this in just a moment. In regards to what sort of images work well with this sort of effect, it definitely works best when there's a clear contrast between the subject and its background. So choose a picture that has an obvious outline that you can trace around. Let's jump into Photoshop and see how we can go about creating a parallax effect. I've opened up a file, and as you can see, it's just a one-layer file. It has an eagle ray over the background. The first thing that I need to do is I need to separate my subject from the background. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the Object Selection tool. This is a tool that allows you to make a selection, and it doesn't have to be very precise. Again, it's going to work best when there's a definite contrast between the subject and the background. But I'll just kind of make a selection of my eagle ray. Photoshop's going to think about it for a second, and then it's going to snap into place. And as you can see, it definitely got some areas that are not wanted. So what I usually do is I'll go into quick mask mode. And if you click this little icon on your timeline, you can enter quick mask mode. I'll zoom in, and then I'll just start to check the edges of the shape. Now, this is not a perfect cutout, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time making it absolutely perfect. I'm just going to go ahead and touch up the edges a little bit. You may want to spend a little bit more time making sure your cutout is a bit more precise if you're interested in making this parallax effect and having it look really good. If we zoom in, you can see how the default selection isn't optimal, but this will work pretty well regardless. It is worth noting that I'm using the keyboard shortcut of my left and right bracket keys, which allow me to temporarily change the brush size. So if I hit my left bracket key, you'll notice that the brush gets smaller, and the right bracket key is going to make the brush bigger. So I find it really useful to just go ahead and tap the various bracket keys when I want to increase or decrease the size of my brush. The tail is going to take us a little bit more time since the object selection did not do a fabulous job on this. You can continue to paint with the brush tool, and if you paint with black, you're basically removing these elements from the selection. If you painted with white, you would be adding to the selection. In this case, it might be a little bit easier for me to use a different tool, so I'm going to switch to my Polygon Lasso tool, and then I'm just going to make a quick selection of the tail. For the most part, the tail is pretty much straight, so all I have to do is just click and lay down a new point on the path that I'm using. So I'll just kind of race around the ending portion of this tail, make my selection, and then when I want to complete the path, I'll look for that little circle that appears in the lower right hand corner, or you can double click. Now that I have this path selected, I'll go back to my brush tool, and if I paint with white, once again I'm adding to the selection. Now I'm just going to simply do a select inverse, and I'll want to switch my foreground and background color. I'm using the keyboard shortcut of X to quickly swap those. I'm just going to paint with black to remove this portion from my selection. And in this case, I can be kind of sloppy and just go right over the tail because the selection is protecting parts of the image. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to drop my selection. I'm using the keyboard shortcut of Command or Control D to drop a selection. And now I'll get out of quick mask mode by either tapping Q or clicking this icon right here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my background layer. So I'll just drag this down to the new layer icon to create a copy. I'll name this Eagle Ray. And I'm going to create a layer mask. So I'll click the layer mask icon, which makes a mask. if I was to hide the original background layer, you can see I just have a selection of the eagle ray, which is exactly what I want. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the mask and we'll open up the property inspector, and I'm going to feather the mask by 1 pixel. This is just going to soften the mask, and that will help to clean up our edges a little bit. At this point, I'm going to load the mask. I'll hold down on my Command or Control key. I'll click in the mask layer, which is going to load the contents of the mask as a selection. Now I'm going to go to Select, Modify, Expand. And we're going to want to expand the selection out by 10 pixels. This is simply going to just increase this selection slightly. I'll go back to the background layer, and we're going to use a little bit of Photoshop to remove the eagle ray in the background layer. In order for us to be able to perform this, we're going to rename the background layer so it's not locked. So I'll just double click, and we can just really call this background. It just has to be renamed so that little padlock disappears. Now I'll go to Edit, and I'm going to use my Content Aware Fill. Photoshop's going to automatically do its magic. It's giving me a preview of what the results are going to be, and as you can see, this looks really good. So I'll just go ahead and click OK. If we deselect, you can see that Photoshop really did an excellent job removing the eagle ray from the background. And this was very quick. Some images you may need to go in and use the clone stamp tool and kind of touch up, but for this image, I think everything looks fine. It also is worth noting that my image is pretty large, so you may need to zoom in so you can really see what's going on. But for the effect that we're trying to achieve here, I think this is going to work just fine. When we do zoom in, you can see that there is a little bit of area that didn't get touched up completely. If that bugs you or you feel like you need to touch it up, you can use your clone stamp tool. And if you hold down your Option or Alt key, that allows you to sample with the clone stamp, and you could just kind of come in from some different areas and just touch that up. But in all honesty, you're not going to really even notice this, so I think that looks fine. I'll hold down Command or Control 0 just to make everything fit in, and as you can see, when I did the Content Aware Fill, it made the fill on its own layer. I want these to be merged onto one layer, so I'll select both of these layers, and we're just going to use Command E to merge them onto one layer. Now I have a layer called Background Copy, and I have the eagle ray, and each of these items are on their own layer. The next step is to convert these layers to smart objects. I'll go ahead and select my background copy. I'm going to right-click or Command or Control click to open the contextual menu, and you're going to want to choose Convert to Smart Object. The reason that we need these elements to be smart objects is so that we can use the timeline and we'll be able to do transformations like rotation and or scaling. You can always tell an item is a smart object because the icon is going to look like this in the layer pane. Now that I have my smart objects created, I'll go to the timeline and I'll click Create Video Timeline. If you don't see Video Timeline, you're going to want to hold down on the downward pointing arrow and switch to Create Video Timeline. Once you've done that, you can click this button and that will go ahead and create a video timeline that contains all of the layers in your document. Now I'm going to begin animating, but before we actually do that, let's change our image size so that the image is a more manageable size. This will help keep our file size a little smaller, and we just don't need this much information. I'll go to Image, Canvas Size, and this is going to allow me to change the size of the canvas. I'll go ahead and plug in 1920 by 1080. These are typical sizes for video. When we do this, it is going to crop the document, and that's fine because we're going to go ahead and be animating and resizing the elements. As you can see, the eagle ray is being cropped and the background is cropped as well. I'll start off by going to the eagle ray layer, and before I start creating keyframes, I'm going to resize this down to the starting position. Currently, I'm showing my transform controls so I can easily begin transformations. If you don't have this on, you may need to use Command or Control T to turn on transformations for that layer. Once you've done that, you'll be able to resize the image. If you hold down your Shift key, you'll constrain the scaling to be proportionate. If you add the Option or Alt key, you'll go ahead and scale from the center. I'm going to scale the eagle ray down so that it's roughly the size of the canvas. I'll also nudge it down to put it in place. I'm going to hit Return to accept those changes. We'll do something similar to the background layer. I'll select the background layer. I'm going to use Command or Control T, and then I will hold down my Shift and Option key as I scale. This is going to allow me to scale down. Now, I'm going to actually leave the background quite large to begin with. So we'll leave the background large, but we'll reposition it so that the eagle ray is half on the blue water and the reef portion. Now I'm ready to begin animating. I'll start off with the eagle ray. At frame 1, I'm going to turn on keyframing for transformation. This sets the keyframe with the eagle ray at this particular position. Next, I'll move the playback head to the end of the timeline. By default, Photoshop gives me a 5-second animation. You can easily extend or clip this if you want to change the duration, but for our purposes, we'll leave this at 5 seconds. Once the playback head is at this location, once again, we'll use Command or Control T, and now I'm going to scale the eagle ray down. So we'll make the eagle ray much smaller. I'm going to go ahead and hit Return to accept the changes. Next, we'll animate the background. I'm going to go back to frame 1. We'll open up the background layer and turn on keyframing for transformations. I'll move the playback head to the end, and here we'll go ahead and we'll scale this as well. I'll use Command or Control T, and as you can see, I may need to zoom out so I can see the constraints or bounding boxes of the element. I'm going to hold down Shift Option to scale down, and we'll also reposition this so that the background is going to fit within the frame. I'll hit Return to accept the changes. Now, if we want to see what happens with our animation, we'll just simply need to rewind to the beginning, and then I can hit the play button, or the keyboard shortcut is the space bar. It is worth mentioning that the first time that you play your animation, it is going to be very stuttery and take a little bit of time. That's because the animation needs to be rendered. And if you notice this green line that appears at the top of the timeline, this is the render bar. So until the animation has been fully rendered, it will not play in real time. You'll need to be patient and wait for Photoshop to fully render out the animation until you can preview it in real time. The larger your document is, the longer it will take to preview and render out the animation. So it's always worth resizing the file down so you're not dealing with any unnecessary rendering. Now that we have the green bar, if we hit the space bar, you can see that it's going to play in real time. Currently, both of the items are scaling down. What I ultimately want to do to create the parallax effect is I want to create an opposing animation. So to do this, I'm going to grab the first keyframe and drag it over here near the end. Then I'll grab the ending keyframe and drag it to the beginning. We're going to swap the keyframes so that our eagle ray starts small and then gets bigger. This will allow us to create more of the parallax effect. When we scale the elements in opposite directions, it will intensify this effect. Since I made a change to the animation, Photoshop will need to re-render the animation out before it plays in real time. I'll just speed through this part of the process to save time. Now let's see what it looks like once it's been fully rendered. As you can see, this is a really cool effect. It tends to work better with more subtle animations where the foreground and backgrounds move at different rates. That's what creates our parallax effect. You can be very creative and do all sorts of cool things using this technique. Let's create another parallax effect using this picture of the Northern Lights. Once again, I'm going to separate the elements that I want to animate. In this case, we're going to separate the foreground from the sky. I'll use my Object Selection tool. Now, as you can see, when I use the Object Selection tool, it does make the selection based on color. In order to add the rest of the foreground to this selection, I'll use the Rectangle Marquee tool. I'll hold down my Shift key to add to the selection, and I'm just going to draw over the lower portion of the image to get all of those pixels. You can always tap Q to jump into Quick Mask mode, and you may want to zoom in case you need to refine the selection. But the Object Selection tool did a great job, so I don't really need to do anything else here. Now that I have that selected, I'm going to click Q to exit Quick Selection mode. And what we'll do is we'll duplicate the background layer. We're going to rename this foreground. And I'm going to use a layer mask to store this information. As you can see, it only stores the foreground portion of the image. To quickly make a selection of the Northern Lights section, I'm going to Command or Control click on the layer mask. That loads that as a selection, and then I'll use Select Inverse. And now we have the Northern Lights selected. Once again, I'm going to go to the background layer. We'll rename this Northern Lights. And I'm going to create a layer mask so that this portion is now saved on its own layer. Now, as you can see, we got a little bit of a line in between the two layers. That's because our selections aren't completely lining up. So I'm just going to do Undo, and I'll actually make a copy of the Northern Lights layer. This will be our original background. And then on the Northern Lights layer, I'm going to create a layer mask. As you can see, we no longer have that little line that appeared between the elements. Now that I have my selections done, I'm ready to begin the animation. Once again, we're going to want to resize our image. So for this one, I'm going to go to Image, Image Size. We're going to change the image globally. I'll change the height to 1920, and I'll just let the width be whatever the natural width is going to be. I'll click OK. The image is going to resize down, which is going to in turn make it smaller and allow Photoshop to be able to process this effect more easily. Next, we'll turn each of the layers that we want to animate into smart objects. Now I'm going to create my video timeline. We're not going to be doing anything on the background layer, so we'll just leave that as is. I'll start off by animating the foreground. I'll go ahead and turn on keyframing for transform. Now, ultimately, this is what we want our image to look like at the end. So I'm immediately going to go to the end of my timeline. I'll tap the diamond to create a new keyframe, and then I'll go back to the beginning portion of my animation. At this point, I'm going to switch to the Move tool and use Command or Control T to open up the transformations. We'll go ahead and scale the foreground up. So I'm holding down my Shift and my Option key, and we'll scale this up so that it's much larger. I'll hit Return to accept those changes. If I scrub through the timeline, you can see that the foreground layer is going to animate going from large to small. Now let's go into the Northern Light layer. For this layer, we're going to turn on keyframing for transform. I'll go to the end of the animation and create another keyframe. And then we'll go back to the beginning keyframe and we're going to make transformations. I'll use Command or Control T to open up the transformation dialog box. And what we're going to do here is we're going to rotate this as well as scaling it up. I want to make sure that it's large enough so that all of the background is obscured. You can see that when I rotate it, the background layer is showing through. We don't want that to show through, so you need to make sure it's large enough so that that doesn't show through. I'm also going to raise this up a little bit so we see more of the interesting northern lights that's happening in this section of the image. I'll need to hit Return or Enter to accept the changes, and if we scrub through the timeline, you're going to see that the sky is going to rotate. Now in the middle of my animation, you can see that we get something that's a little wonky. That's because I moved and rotated this and scaled it, but it wasn't quite large enough. So I'm going to go back to keyframe 1. I'll hit Command or Control T, and we're going to just ensure that this is even larger. I'll want to hit Return or Enter to accept those changes, and then scrub through and make sure I don't get any of those little wonky spots. You can see I have a very slight area in the bottom portion, so I'm going to want to make those adjustments as well. Let's go back to frame 1. I'll hit Command or Control T. I'm going to need to zoom out so that I can scale this a little bit more, and we'll just scale the sky up even more. Once again, I'm going to check the changes to make sure that they look okay, and everything looks good until the very end. Instead of scaling it up anymore, I think I'm just going to make one more keyframe here. So I'm going to place my playback head. I'll use Command or Control T, and then what we'll do is we'll just scale this up a little bit more. I'll hit Return to accept the changes, and then we'll just scrub through to make sure that we don't have any of those strange wonkiness happening. Now there is a tiny little bit that happens right here, but I believe if the background layer is still visible, that's not going to be very noticeable. So we'll just leave that as is. Let's hit spacebar or play so that Photoshop renders out the animation, and then we can play it in real time and make sure that this is exactly how we want it to look. Once the rendering is done, we can play the animation and ensure that everything looks exactly the way we want. As you can see, this effect allows us to create all sorts of really cool media. Once you're happy with the results, you'll want to export your files. This time, instead of exporting as an animated GIF, I'm going to export as a movie. The reason why is because both of the images that we just worked on are photographs, and they are not going to work as well as animated GIFs. So I'll use File, Export, Render to Video. This will open up the Render to Video dialog box. This is using Adobe's Media Encoder. So if you don't get this dialog box, you're going to need to make sure that you have the Adobe Media Encoder installed, which comes with your Creative Cloud subscription, so that Photoshop and other applications will have access to this. You can go ahead and specify a name. I'm going to leave the name so that it matches my Photoshop file that I'm working on. I'll go ahead and I'm going to change the format from high quality, and for this particular example, I'm going to use YouTube HD 1080p. You have a lot of choices in regards to how you want to output this, but this is a safe bet for most videos that you may want to use on the web. I'll leave everything else at the default sizes, and I'll click Render. Photoshop is going to go about exporting the video. This may take a few seconds to a couple minutes depending on the size of the video project that you want to export. Once Photoshop has completed rendering out the video, you'll be able to open it in your video playing software of choice and use it in any way that you want. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial on creating parallax effects, and now have an idea of how you can create these great and interesting sorts of effects using Photoshop.